You are Locked On Ole Miss, your daily podcast on the Ole Miss Rebels. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Thanks for making the Locked On Ole Miss podcast your first listen every day. We're free and available wherever you get your podcast, including YouTube. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every single day. Hello, I'm Stephen Willis from the Locked On Ole Miss podcast, and I'm joined by Macon Gillespie from the Grove Report, and we are going to talk about what's going on around Ole Miss football this week, and we'll also get his top 5 wide receivers in Ole Miss history. How you doing, John?
I'm doing pretty well, Stephen. How are you? Just trying to, stay cool. You and I both know what this time of year brings in our neck of the woods, so it's easier said than done a lot of times.
It's an amazing thing that I realized whenever I moved down here to Central Florida. Summers in Central Florida are actually better than summers in Mississippi.
Really?
Yes. Now, there's some humidity days and they can jump up and get you, but it usually rains every day and kind of breaks it up. But there's not like there's not going to be 1,700 degree days in a row down here. So it's pretty good. My wife, who was scared to move down here because she's from Tennessee and she was worried that it was going to be too hot, she got back down here and she's like, this is better than Tennessee. And I was like, yeah.
Well, the more you know, but I will tell you, it's starting to get pretty rough up here. So
yeah, it's this week, this weekend, starting that into next week, there's going to be 97, 98 degree temperatures down here. And now that is scary. That's where Florida kind of makes its money as far as bad weather goes, because the heat index is going to be about 115, 120 degrees.
Yeah. So, but it just kind of comes with the territory, I guess. And you live in it long enough, you kind of get used to it, but you also never really fully get used to it, I think. Of course, I've lived in it my whole life, but it's never easy.
The first time I took my wife down to Newton, Mississippi, spent the night at my dad's house. Her first night spent in Mississippi, she woke up sweating. And at that point, she was like, how do you do this? And I was like, I don't know. That's how I've always done it. I mean,
eventually you kind of become acclimated to it a little bit,
So yeah, she doesn't like the heat. So that made her nervous about down here, but she loves it down here. This is probably the second best place we've ever lived, with the first being La Maddalena, Italy.
That makes sense.
Yeah. So that's pretty cool. Anyway, let's talk about this week. SEC StatCat, if you want to follow SEC StatCat on Twitter, they have some pretty good analytical breakdowns of SEC football. It's at a minimum, it's interesting stuff. I'm not a huge analytical person, but he does like all the expected sacks and the impact rates and all those special statistics. But he released a top 50 list this week of the top 50 most impactful transfers. And I thought it was interesting that 4 Ole Miss players are in the top 12. Like 33% of the top 12 was Ole Miss players. What do you think about that? Who are the players do you think he was talking about?
I think Walter Nolan has to be in that list, right? Okay.
He was number 1 on the list.
Okay. What about Princely Emmanuel, number 2?
Princely's 3.
Oh, he's 3. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Did he have Juice Wells in there?
Yes, number 11.
Okay.
And this is going to be the one that gets you.
I want to say Trey Amos, but I don't. I feel like that's going to be wrong.
Yeah, it's Diego Pounds.
Really?
Yes. He talked about statistically and analytically speaking, Diego Pounds scored 8 points higher than the highest offensive lineman Ole Miss's team a year ago.
Well, I mean, that makes it pretty impactful. That fits the bill.
Yeah, but no Nate Kalepo, who was the best lineman or one of the best linemen on Washington's Joe Moore, a winning offensive line. No Julius Buelow on the list. And no Jerquan Scott. I kind of quietly like Jerquan Scott to have like a Quincy McGee type big impact year.
Right. Yeah, no, I think that is kind of interesting, because I think if you asked most Ole Miss fans which offensive lineman transfer you're most excited about, they'd probably name one of the Washington guys, right?
Mm.
Just because of name recognition and what that unit was able to accomplish last year. But no, I mean, that's really interesting. If there's analytics to back that up, I mean, that's a very positive sign for Ole Miss for sure.
Yeah, and Diego Pounds, I think he's like 340 pounds. He's just a monster of a human being.
Huge human being, yeah.
Yeah, and you're going to put him on the left side. You're going to put him next to Nate Kalepo, one of the Washington guys, who's also a huge human being. And it's going to say, hey, Ulysses Bentley IV, Henry Parrish, have at it, buddy.
Yeah, you have a freeway to kind of run through there if everything goes according to plan. It's that's a really good situation for the running back room. We talk a lot about them trying to kind of replace Judkins's production, which I think they've done a really good job with. But the improvements they've made on the offensive line is going to have a big deal to do with that as well, as far as rushing production is concerned. So that's kind of an overlooked part of it sometimes.
Yeah, the press clippings right now is how good the defensive line could be, and everybody's talking about the defensive line. But if Ole Miss does what we think they're capable of doing, the offensive line will have had a big year.
And especially, this is sometimes overhyped, but especially going up against some of those defensive linemen in practice, that can only help.
And one of your guys, I forget which one, I apologize, but somebody at the Grove Report did a story on the 3 most underrated players on Ole Miss's roster going into this season. And he named Caden Lee, he named Akello Stone, and he named Cam Franklin were his 3 players. And I sat there and looked at that, and that's a good list. I have no problem with the list with them being underrated because I do think they are underrated. But I do think they are all at logjam positions where none of them are going to see very much of the field.
Mm-hmm.
And then I started thinking about who is the most underrated player on this roster. And I circled back to it and everything. It's Jordan Watkins. I've had conversations about wide receivers for 3 months about Ole Miss football, and I hardly mentioned Jordan Watkins because of Deion Smith and Trey Harris and Juice Wells and all of them dominating all the oxygen in the room. But Jordan Watkins was Mr. Reliable for Jackson Dart a year ago. He's the punt returner on the team. He averaged he had 12 or 13 catches of over 20 yards last season. Jordan Watkins is a really good player, and he just is not getting, honestly, his due at the moment.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. And I think it was Jackson Harris, who's a young guy he's actually really coming along pretty well. He's got a lot of great potential. And his focus on the story was, okay, what if somebody in that wideout room goes down? That's when a Caden Lee kind of steps up, kind of like he did last year. But yeah, you're right. I think we do have the and this may be kind of human nature a little bit. You get all these shiny new pieces in, and you have a lot of focus on those. But we kind of forget sometimes in the midst of all that, just what Jordan Watkins has done and what he's been capable of since he's been in Oxford. It really feels like he's been, and this may just be me, but it feels like he's been in Oxford forever to me. And it really hasn't been just that long. But yeah,
he came in with
like
Jackson.
You said, yeah, right. I mean, but he has been super reliable. Obviously, the injury last year kind of impacted him late in the year, but yeah, he's definitely a piece that deserves a lot of attention in this room because even with some of the youth that's below them in the wide receiver room, he's one of those leader guys there with a Trey Harris and stuff. That's really going to make a big impact.
Yeah, and it was something that's underrated important, and I've talked about this on my show pretty consistently, is next season there's not going to be a Trey Harris. There's not going to be a Jordan Watkins. Not going to be a Juice Wells. There's not going to be a Deion Smith, even though he has a year of eligibility. He could come back. His goal was to go to the NFL after 1 year. But this year is important for ingraining into like Aiden Williams and Nareel White and Caden Lee and getting them ready, because those guys, along with some potentially 3 5-star wide receivers, if Ole Miss gets to all the ones that are visiting, and Caleb Cunningham and Jerome Miles and Winston Watkins, I think that's his name, Watkins, the kid out of Fort Myers. They're all of them are 5 stars in at least one service. So if you get those, you want to do culture. Everybody talks about culture, how that's a thing. You want to have chemistry. Well, this year is important for the young guys, Aiden Williams and Nareel White and Caden Lee, to really drill down. Isaiah Hartrip, who has an extra year of eligibility, who'll be back, to kind of soak in the work ethic and how it's done, because the supremely talented guys are coming in next year and you want it to be as seamless as possible.
Mm-hmm. And the ones who are soaking up the culture, so to speak, this year are going to be the ones that's dishing it out next year. Going to be the ones that's continuing that foundation a little bit. Yeah, I think that's a really good point. This is, and I do think they'll see some reps, but I mean, this is still a year about a lot of soaking in as much as you can behind what on paper appears to be one of the best, if not the best, receiver rooms in the country.
Yeah, and I'm pretty fired up about, what Ole Miss can do because wide receiver it's always been an important thing for Lane Kiffin. Everybody that knows Lane Kiffin knows that he got to start at USC in the wide receiver room. Lane Kiffin is the guy who built that Alabama receiving room that had all the dudes on. He is known for doing exactly what he's trying to do next year. But in this transfer portal world where you just can't stock people in front to have it, you have to kind of pre-plan. Like, I think Isaiah Hartrip, he's a really good player. He's talented. I think he has a chance for a Dayton Wade type impact coming into this season. But if he doesn't, he is still a guy that you can count on to work really hard, to do really well on special teams and be ready for next year as a severe veteran leader.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's, I think a lot of the focus in this transfer portal era is on the here and now. And I do think that Hartrip is a very good example of potentially planning ahead in that vein of thought a little bit. Because and I mean, Ole Miss has done this too. So much of this is, you hear people refer to them as 1-year rentals, kind of essentially. It's good to be able to snag some guys, even if it's out of the portal, who are not that, who can be with you, past just 1 year. And I think he really fits that bill.
Thanks again for making the Locked On Ole Miss podcast your first listen every day. When we come back, we're going to put John Macon Gillespie on the hot seat. Top 5 wide receivers in Ole Miss history. But first, Gametime is the place for your NBA Finals tickets with the killer last-minute deals, all-in prices, views from your seat, and their lowest price guarantee. Gametime takes the guesswork out of buying NBA tickets. Views from every seat in the venue. No matter where you are, you can see exactly what it's going to look like. They do have the lowest price guarantee. They have event cancellation protection, job loss protection, all the customer service bells and whistles that you would want. So you can take the guesswork out of buying NBA tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONCOLLEGE for $20 off. Download Gametime today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. Are you watching Fox Sports or ESPN on your TV all day long and you have to turn down the volume with all of that screaming and shouting? Make the switch to Locked On Sports today. It's a free 24/7 sports streaming channel programmed for you every single day to bring you the biggest stories without all of that screaming. Locked On Sports Today brings you can't miss analysis, opinions, and news streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Fire TV channels app, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. All right, so today on the hot seat is John Macon Gillespie. The question is the top wide receivers in Ole Miss history. And for those who might be unfamiliar with what we do, it's a true countdown. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. We figure out how it's going to go. So let's get it started right now. John Macon Gillespie, number 5.
This shows just how difficult this exercise was for me, who I have at number 5. I've got Dante Moncrief coming in at number 5. Obviously, I think he's one of the top receivers in school history, but with all the names I have above him, I had to put him somewhere, so he wound up falling at 5. But that Feed Moncrief mantra still kind of rings out a little bit today, you'll still find. So, and he went on to have an NFL career as well. So that's where I put him.
Yeah, and he's kind of turned into a little bit of a super recruiter once he got out of the league as well. You see him on social media quite a bit. Number 4.
DK Metcalf, and that feels unseasonably low for him. But looking back at his stats, obviously he had some injury troubles in college. What he's gone on to do in the NFL has been superb. I think he's one of the best receivers in the NFL today. And his talent was very evident in Oxford, but obviously injury troubles kind of impacted him from a stat category.
Yeah, it's a situation. He did not make my top 5 list because he only played like 16 games in Oxford. And who do you put in? Who do you take out because of it? And he kind of lost the tiebreaker there. So number 3.
Shea Hodge, I have him at number 3. Second all time in school history in receiving yardage and touchdowns. Doing some research for this, I discovered that he's really high on that list. And of course, I remember him playing. But it's kind of surprising just to think of all the guys that have come after him, and those records, those places are still kind of holding firm for him a little bit.
If Shea Hodge played in today's football, like they still had a fullback on the teams that Shea Hodge played on. If he played in today's era, what is it, 16 years later, Shea Hodge would have every Ole Miss record, and it would not be particularly close.
Yeah, I interviewed him last year, I guess it was, and he was a very good interview, and he talked some about that. It was really good.
Number 2,
I have Elijah Moore. I think he's 4th all time in school history in receiving yards. But what Lane Kiffin was able to do with him once he got to Oxford, I think, was huge. And I don't know if this is really appropriate, but I have him at number 2 because of his celebration that brought Lane Kiffin to Oxford in the first place. So I wound up putting him a little higher because of that, but obviously a really great talent who's gone on to the NFL.
Okay, well now I have questions because number 1 is either A.J. Brown or Laquan Treadwell, but it can't be both of them. So which one is it?
I have A.J. Brown as number 1. He's the school record holder in career receiving yardage. Obviously, the impact he had on this program when it was not in a very good place, I think goes worth noting. I mean, he's obviously gone on to be one of the highest paid receivers in the NFL after his time at Ole Miss.
Okay, honorable mention. I like Laquan Treadwell, right?
Yeah, I have him probably at number 6. And like I said, it was so hard to not include somebody, but somebody had to not be included. Obviously, he had a great career at Ole Miss. The injury, though, obviously kind of took him a step back. But he was superb in his time in Oxford.
Any other receivers that maybe like a Vince Sanders that would pop up on your honorable mention?
Chris Collins, maybe. He was really good in that stat category in an era of football with Eli that was still a little different than it is today. Like fullbacks and running the ball, I formation, all that stuff. He put up some really impressive numbers in his time in Oxford too. So I would have him in there. Yeah, maybe Vince Sanders. Trying to think of maybe who else. Those would probably be the main ones that off the top of my head.
All right. Thanks again for making the Locked On Ole Miss podcast your first and listen every day. We're free and available wherever you get your podcast, including YouTube. We are part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. John Macon Gillespie, Grove Report. What do you got going on in the Grove Report this weekend?
Well, we're still just kind of trugging along through the summer. Gonna keep talking some recruiting, keep looking ahead to the season. Obviously some of the comments, we didn't talk about it today. Some of the comments from the Rebel Road trip stop in Memphis were pretty interesting. We've talked some about that. Really, I mean, we're in it. I mean, it's talking season. That's kind of where we are. So that'll be a lot of what's going on over the next week or so.
Or as I call it, money season.
Well, that too. Yeah. Yeah.
So anyway, take care, buddy. And if you have any questions, need anything, let me know.
All right. Appreciate it, Stephen. Thank you.